Sarah Martinez clutched her coffee cup tighter as she watched the rain streak down the hospital cafeteria window. Her nurse uniform felt heavy after another exhausting 12-hour shift in the emergency room. At 28, she had dedicated her life to helping others, but lately, she wondered if anyone would ever care for her the way she cared for her patients. "Rough night?" a deep voice asked from behind her. She turned to see Dr. Alexander Kane, the hospital's most successful surgeon. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his expensive watch caught the fluorescent lights. Everyone knew Dr. Kane came from old money and had built an even larger fortune through his medical practice and investments. He was the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers and charity event guest lists. "Every night is rough in the ER," Sarah replied, surprised he was talking to her. Doctors like Alexander Kane usually didn't notice nurses like her. He sat down across from her without invitation, his blue eyes studying her face with unusual intensity. "You look tired. When was the last time someone took care of you?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I take care of myself just fine, thank you." Alexander smiled, and she noticed how it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sure you do. But everyone deserves to be pampered sometimes. Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? Somewhere nice. Somewhere that serves real food. Not hospital vending machine snacks." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Dr. Alexander Kane was asking her on a date? The man who drove a different luxury car each week and lived in the penthouse apartment overlooking the city? The same man who had dated supermodels and socialites according to the hospital gossip? "I don't think we travel in the same circles," she said carefully. "Circles are overrated," Alexander replied, leaning forward. "I've been watching you, Sarah. You're different from other women I know. You're real, genuine. You care about people, not just what they can do for you." Something in his voice made her stomach flutter. She had been alone for so long, focusing entirely on her career and helping her sick mother with medical bills. The idea of someone like Alexander Kane being interested in her seemed impossible. Yet here he was, looking at her like she was the only person in the room. "I don't know." She hesitated. "One dinner," he said softly. "If you hate it, I'll never bother you again. But if you enjoy yourself, maybe we can see where this goes. I promise you'll be safe with me." The way he said safe sent a strange shiver down her spine, though she couldn't understand why. There was something almost protective in his tone, as if he knew about dangers she couldn't imagine. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself nodding. "Okay, one dinner." Alexander's smile widened, and this time it seemed more genuine. "Perfect. I'll pick you up at 7 tomorrow. Wear something comfortable. And Sarah?" He reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "Thank you for giving me a chance." As he walked away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed forever. She didn't know if it was for better or worse. But Alexander Kane had awakened something in her that had been sleeping for far too long. The next evening, Sarah stood in front of her small apartment mirror, nervous about her choice of a simple black dress. She had spent her entire paycheck on it, hoping it would be appropriate for wherever Alexander was taking her. When the knock came at her door, her heart hammered against her ribs. Alexander stood in her doorway wearing a perfectly tailored suit, holding a single white rose. "You look beautiful," he said, and the way he looked at her made her believe it. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the flower. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, offering his arm. As they walked to his black Mercedes, Sarah noticed how Alexander kept checking the shadows around them, his eyes scanning the parking lot with the alertness of someone expecting trouble. When she asked about it, he just smiled and said he was always careful in the city at night. The restaurant he chose was unlike anywhere Sarah had ever been. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and each table was set with more silverware than she knew how to use. The maitre d' greeted Alexander by name and led them to a private table in an alcove overlooking the city lights. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed, looking around at the elegant surroundings. "Nothing's too good for you," Alexander said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Order whatever you want. Tonight is about you." Throughout dinner, Alexander was the perfect gentleman.
He asked about her dreams, her family, her hopes for the future.
He listened intently when she talked about her mother's illness and her struggles to pay the medical bills. When she mentioned feeling guilty about spending money on the dress, he gently took her hand. "Sarah, you deserve beautiful things. You deserve to be treated like the extraordinary woman you are. Don't ever feel guilty for wanting more than just survival." His words touched something deep inside her. For the first time in years, someone was seeing her as more than just a caregiver, more than just someone who sacrificed everything for others. As the evening progressed, Secre found herself falling under Alexander's spell. He was charming, intelligent, and surprisingly vulnerable when he talked about losing his parents in a car accident and how it drove him to become a doctor. But there were moments when his expression would darken, when he would glance toward the restaurant's entrance with that same alertness she had noticed earlier. "Is everything okay?" she asked during one of these moments. Alexander's attention snapped back to her and he smiled apologetically. "Sorry, old habits. I sometimes get distracted thinking about work." But Secre had the distinct feeling that whatever was distracting him had nothing to do with medicine. Still, when he reached across the table and took her hand, all her concerns melted away. "Secre," he said softly, "I know this might sound crazy since we just met, but I feel like I've been waiting for you my entire life. Would you consider letting me take care of you? I mean, really take care of you?" The intensity in his voice made her pulse quicken. Part of her wanted to run, sensing that Alexander Kane was far more complicated than he appeared. But a larger part of her was drawn to his strength, his confidence, and the way he looked at her like she was precious beyond measure. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "I mean, I want to be the one who makes sure you never have to worry about money again. I want to be the one who holds you when you've had a bad day. I want to be the person you come home to." Sarah's breath caught. It was too much, too fast, but something about Alexander made her want to throw caution to the wind. "I'd like that," she heard herself say, and knew there was no going back. 3 weeks later, Sarah's life had transformed beyond recognition. Alexander had insisted on paying off her mother's medical bills, and when Secre protested, he had simply smiled and said, "This is what people do for those they care about." He bought her a new wardrobe, took her to expensive restaurants, and showered her with gifts that made her feel like a princess in a fairy tale. But it was the quiet moments that made her fall for him completely. The way he would show up at the hospital with her favorite coffee during her breaks, how he would listen to her talk about difficult patients without judgment, the gentle way he massaged her tired feet after long shifts. Alexander Kane was becoming everything she had never dared to dream of having. "Move in with me," he said one evening as they sat on his penthouse balcony. The city spread out below them like a carpet of lights. Sarah's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "Alexander, we've only been dating for 3 weeks. I know it seems fast," he said, moving closer on the expensive outdoor sofa. "But I've never felt this way about anyone before. My penthouse is huge and empty without you. Besides, think about how much easier it would be. No more commuting from your apartment. No more worrying about rent or bills. I want to take care of you completely." The offer was tempting. Alexander's penthouse was like something from a movie, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a gourmet kitchen, and a master bedroom larger than her entire apartment. More importantly, she was falling in love with him, and the thought of waking up next to him every morning made her heart race. "What about my independence?" she asked weakly. Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "You can be independent and still let someone love you. Secre, I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to give you the life you deserve." 2 days later, Secre was moving her few belongings into Alexander's penthouse. Her friends at the hospital thought she was crazy for moving so fast, but they also couldn't argue with how happy she looked. For the first time in her adult life, Secre felt truly cared for. Living with Alexander was like being in a dream. He would leave little love notes for her to find when she came home from work. He hired a housekeeper so Secre wouldn't have to worry about cleaning after her exhausting shifts. On her days off, he would take her shopping or to art galleries, always holding her hand and treating her like she was the most important person in the world. But slowly, Secre began to notice strange things. Alexander received phone calls at odd hours that he would take in his study with the door closed. Sometimes she would catch fragments of conversations that didn't sound like medical consultations, words like payment, territory, and problem spoken in a tone she had never heard him use before. When she asked about these calls, Alexander would simply say they were related to his investments or medical practice. He would then distract her with kisses or plans for another romantic evening, and Secre would forget her questions in the warmth of his attention. One evening, Secre came home early from work due to a scheduling change. As she entered the penthouse, she heard Alexander's voice coming from his study. talking more harshly than she had ever heard him speak. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying. "The deadline is tomorrow and I expect full payment. If they can't come up with the money, then we move to the next phase." Sarah froze in the hallway, her heart pounding. This didn't sound like any medical conversation she could imagine. The cold authority in Alexander's voice was completely different from the gentle, loving man she knew. "No exceptions," Alexander continued. "I've been patient long enough. Make sure they understand the consequences of disappointing me." Sarah quietly backed toward the front door, her mind racing. Who was Alexander talking to? What kind of payment was he discussing? And what did he mean by consequences? She waited outside in the hallway for 10 minutes before using her key again, this time making enough noise to announce her arrival. When Alexander emerged from his study, he was back to being the loving, gentle man she knew. "You're early," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I missed you." "Bad day at the hospital," Sarah lied, studying his face for any sign of the hardness she had heard in his voice. "They sent me home." Alexander's expression filled with concern. "Are you feeling okay? You look pale." "Just tired," she said, allowing him to hold her, even though her mind was spinning with questions. That night, as Alexander slept beside her, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling. She told herself she was overthinking things. Alexander was a successful doctor and businessman. Of course, he would have to deal with difficult clients or patients who couldn't pay their bills. That would explain the harsh tone and talk of payments. But deep in her heart, Sarah knew what she had heard wasn't about medical bills. The next morning, Alexander was unusually attentive, bringing her breakfast in bed and insisting she take the day off to rest. When she protested that she felt fine, he kissed her forehead and said, "Humor me. I worry about you working too hard." While Alexander was at the hospital, Sarah found herself alone in the penthouse with her troubling thoughts. She tried to focus on reading, but her eyes kept drifting to Alexander's study. The door was always locked when he wasn't home, and she had never questioned it before. As she was making lunch, Sarah's phone rang. It was her friend Jessica from the hospital. "Girl, you need to see the news," Jessica said without preamble. "Remember that businessman who was found beaten up behind the downtown warehouse district last week? The one who couldn't pay back some kind of loan?" Sarah's blood turned cold. "What about him?" "They just arrested the guys who did it." But here's the weird part. The businessman said he had been threatened by someone calling himself the doctor. The police think it might be some kind of code name for a loan shark or something. The phone slipped from Sarah's numb fingers. Alexander was a doctor. Alexander had been talking about payments and consequences. Alexander had been acting strange lately, taking mysterious phone calls and speaking in a voice she didn't recognize. But it was impossible. Alexander Kane was one of the most respected surgeons in the city. He came from a wealthy family and had built his own fortune through legitimate means. He couldn't possibly be involved in anything illegal, could he? Sarah picked up her phone with shaking hands. "Jessica, I have to go." "Sarah, are you okay? You sound weird." "I'm fine," Sarah lied. "I'll talk to you later." As she hung up, Sarah realized that she might not know Alexander Kane at all. The man who had swept her off her feet, who had promised to take care of her, who had made her feel like the most loved woman in the world, might be hiding something dark and dangerous, and she was living in his home, completely dependent on him with nowhere to run. That evening, when Alexander returned from work, Sarah watched him carefully. He was the same loving, attentive man as always, asking about her day and insisting on cooking dinner for her. But now she noticed things she had missed before, the way his expensive suits fit perfectly, as if tailored to hide things, the careful way he positioned himself to always have a view of the doors, the fact that he never talked about his childhood friends or mentioned anyone from his past. "Alexander," she said carefully as they sat down to dinner, "tell me about your family." Something flickered in his eyes before he smiled. "You know about my parents? They died when I was young. But what about before that? What about extended family? Old friends?" Alexander set down his fork and studied her face. "Why the sudden interest in my past?" Sarah forced herself to smile naturally. "I love you. I want to know everything about you." For a moment, Alexander's expression was unreadable. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, some things are better left in the past. What matters is our future together." The way he avoided her question sent a chill down her spine. Sarah realized that the man she had fallen in love with was a complete mystery. and she was beginning to suspect that the truth about Alexander Kane was more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Alexander's voice from the phone call, cold and threatening. She lay perfectly still next to him, listening to his steady breathing, wondering if the man beside her was capable of violence. When morning came, Alexander was already dressed for work, looking immaculate in his dark suit. He kissed her goodbye as usual, but Sarah noticed how his eyes lingered on her face as if he was studying her. "I'll be late tonight," he said. "Emergency surgery. Don't wait up for me." After he left, Sarah sat in the enormous living room feeling smaller than ever. The penthouse that had seemed like a palace now felt like a beautiful prison. She realized how isolated she had become since moving in with Alexander. She had been so caught up in their romance that she had barely spoken to her old friends. Even her mother had commented that Sarah seemed different lately, though she couldn't put her finger on how. Sarah decided she needed answers. She had to know who Alexander really was, even if the truth destroyed everything between them. She started by searching his name online, but found only the expected results: medical journal articles, charity event photos, and newspaper mentions of his successful surgeries. Dr. Alexander Kane appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be: a brilliant, wealthy surgeon with an impeccable reputation. But Sarah remembered something Jessica had said about the doctor being a code name. If Alexander was involved in something illegal, he would be careful to keep his two lives completely separate. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that terrified her. She called in sick to work and took a taxi to the downtown warehouse district where the businessman had been beaten. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she needed to see the place for herself. The area was run down and industrial, nothing like the elegant world Alexander had introduced her to. As she walked around, Sarah felt completely out of place in her expensive clothes and jewelry, all gifts from Alexander. "You lost, lady?" a gruff voice asked behind her. Sarah turned to see an older man in coveralls watching her suspiciously. "I'm looking for information about what happened here last week. The businessman who was attacked." The man's expression darkened. "You a cop?" "No, I think I might know something about it." The man studied her for a long moment. "You better be careful who you ask questions about. The doctor don't like people poking around in his business." Sarah's heart stopped. "The doctor? Look, lady, I don't know who you are, but if you're smart, you'll forget whatever brought you here. The doctor runs things in this part of town, and he don't forgive people who cross him." Before Sarah could ask more questions, the man walked away, leaving her standing alone in the empty lot where someone had been beaten for failing to pay the doctor. On the taxi ride home, Sarah's mind raced. It could be a coincidence. There could be another person calling himself the doctor, but deep in her heart, she knew the truth was staring her in the face. That evening, Alexander returned home earlier than expected, carrying a bouquet of her favorite flowers. "Feeling better?" he asked, kissing her cheek. Sarah had to force herself not to flinch at his touch. "Much better. How was the surgery?" "Successful," he said, but something in his tone made her think he wasn't talking about a medical procedure. Over dinner, Alexander was more attentive than usual, asking detailed questions about her day and watching her responses carefully. Sarah felt like she was being interrogated, though Alexander's manner remained gentle and loving. "Sarah," he said as they finished eating, "you seem tense lately. Is everything okay between us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked into his blue eyes, the same eyes that had made her feel so safe and loved, and wondered if they had ever been capable of watching someone get hurt. "I love you, Alexander," she said, which was still true despite everything. "I just worry sometimes that I don't really know you." Alexander reached across the table and took her hands in his. His touch was warm and gentle, just as it had always been. "You know everything important about me," he said softly. "You know that I love you more than anything in the world. You know that I would do anything to protect you. Isn't that enough?" The way he said anything sent a shiver through Sarah. Was Alexander protecting her by keeping her away from his other life? Or was he protecting his secrets by keeping her isolated and dependent on him? "What if someone tried to hurt me?" she asked, testing him. "What would you do?" Alexander's expression went completely still. For a moment, Sarah saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes before his gentle smile returned. "No one will ever hurt you while I'm around," he said with quiet certainty. "I promise you that." The conviction in his voice terrified her. Sarah realized that Alexander Kane was capable of violence, and he would justify it as protection. That night, while Alexander slept, Sarah made a decision. She needed to find proof of what Alexander was really doing. She needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed her world. Sarah slipped out of bed and crept toward Alexander's study. She had watched him enter the code for the door lock enough times to memorize it. Her birthday. Even his security measures were romantic gestures. The study was dark and silent. Sarah used her phone's flashlight to navigate around Alexander's desk, careful not to disturb anything. The desk drawers were locked, but she knew Alexander kept a spare key in a small decorative box on his bookshelf. Her hands were shaking as she opened the first drawer. Inside were normal business documents, medical journals, and what appeared to be legitimate investment papers. For a moment, Sarah felt a wave of relief. Maybe she had been wrong about everything. Then she opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a cell phone she had never seen before, along with a leather notebook and several thick envelopes. Sarah opened the notebook with trembling fingers and found pages of names, amounts, and dates. Next to some names were check marks. Next to others were notes like "final warning" and "collection required." At the bottom of one page, written in Alexander's careful handwriting, were the words, "Payment overdue, enforce consequences." Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the name next to those words. It was the businessman who had been beaten in the warehouse district. The cell phone contained text messages that made Sarah's blood turn cold. Conversations about territories, collections, and people who had learned their lesson. The phone was registered to someone called A. Kane, but the messages were signed with a simple D for doctor. In the envelopes, Sarah found photographs. Pictures of people entering and leaving buildings. Pictures of families. Pictures that looked like surveillance photos. At the bottom of the stack was a photograph that made her gasp out loud. It was a picture of herself, taken before she had ever met Alexander. The photo showed her leaving the hospital after a shift, completely unaware she was being watched. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Target acquired. Proceed with contact." Sarah's world crumbled around her. Their meeting hadn't been a coincidence. Alexander's interest in her hadn't been natural attraction. Everything, their romantic dinner, his declarations of love, his insistence that she move in with him, had been planned. She was not Alexander's girlfriend. She was his target, but target for what? As Sarah stared at her own photograph, she realized she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Alexander Kane wasn't just involved in illegal activities. He had specifically chosen her for reasons she couldn't understand. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Sarah's heart stop. Alexander was awake and moving through the penthouse. Sarah quickly replaced everything in the drawer, turned off her phone's flashlight, and tried to sneak back to the bedroom. But as she reached for the study door, the hallway light came on. "Sarah?" Alexander's voice called out, confused and alert. "What are you doing?" Sarah stood frozen in his study doorway, caught in the act of discovering his secrets. When Alexander saw where she was standing, his expression changed completely. The gentle, loving man she knew disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. "I see you've been exploring," he said quietly, and Sarah realized that her life had just become very dangerous indeed. Alexander stood in the hallway perfectly still, watching Sarah with eyes that had gone completely cold. The man who had whispered sweet words of love to her was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. In the dim light, he looked more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. "I can explain," Sarah whispered, though she knew there was no explanation that would make this better. "I'm sure you can," Alexander said, his voice eerily calm. "But first, why don't you tell me what you found in there?" Sarah's mind raced. Should she lie? Should she tell the truth? Either choice felt like it could get her killed. "I was looking for a pen," she said weakly. Alexander smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "A pen in my locked study. At 3 a.m. He stepped closer and Sarah instinctively backed against the doorframe. "Sarah, we've gotten to know each other pretty well over the past few weeks. I think we're past the point of lying to each other, don't you?" The way he said it made Sarah's blood turn to ice. Alexander knew exactly what she had discovered, and he was deciding what to do about it. "Come sit down," he said, gesturing toward the living room. "We need to talk, it wasn't a request." Sarah walked to the sofa on unsteady legs, acutely aware that Alexander was watching her every move. He sat across from her in his expensive armchair, the same chair where he had told her he loved her just weeks ago. "How much did you see?" he asked conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. Sarah considered lying again, but something about Alexander's tone warned her against it. "Enough," she said quietly. "Enough to know that I'm not exactly the man you thought you fell in love with?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "You know, Sarah, this is disappointing. I had hoped we could continue our relationship without you ever needing to know about my other business interests." "Other business interests?" Sarah found her voice. "Alexander, you're hurting people. That man in the warehouse district is alive and well," Alexander interrupted smoothly. "He learned an important lesson about honoring his commitments, and now he's a model client. Sometimes people need motivation to do the right thing." The casual way he spoke about violence made Sarah feel sick. "You're a doctor. You took an oath to help people." "I help people every day," Alexander said. "I perform life-saving surgeries. I contribute to medical research. I donate to charities. But I also run a business that provides financial services to people who can't get help from traditional banks." "You mean you're a loan shark?" Alexander's expression hardened slightly. "I prefer to think of myself as someone who helps people when no one else will. Yes, my interest rates are high, and yes, I expect to be repaid on time. But I give opportunities to people who would otherwise have none." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You have people beaten when they can't pay." "I have consequences for people who break their agreements," Alexander corrected. "Sarah, the world isn't the fairy tale you think it is. Sometimes force is the only language people understand." The man sitting across from her was a complete stranger. The gentle doctor who had swept her off her feet had been an act, a character Alexander played when it suited him. "Why me?" Sarah asked, remembering the surveillance photo. "Our meeting wasn't an accident, was it?" For the first time, Alexander's expression softened slightly. "No, it wasn't an accident. But that doesn't mean my feelings for you aren't real." "Tell me the truth," Sarah demanded, surprised by her own courage. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I needed someone in the medical field, someone with access to hospital records, patient information, and medical supplies, someone trustworthy and smart, but not so connected that they would be missed if things went wrong." Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "You targeted me for my job." "Initially, yes," Alexander admitted. "But then I got to know you and everything changed." "Sarah, I've never felt this way about anyone before. What started as business became something real." "How can you say that?" Sarah's voice broke. "You manipulated me. You made me fall in love with you under false pretenses." "Did I?" Alexander leaned forward. "Every moment we've shared has been genuine. Every word of love I've spoken has been true. Yes, I approached you for business reasons, but I stayed because I couldn't imagine my life without you." Sarah wanted to believe him, but how could she trust anything he said? "What did you need me for? What's this really about?" Alexander studied her for another long moment. "There are people in my organization who occasionally need medical attention. People who can't go to regular hospitals because of the nature of their work. I needed someone who could provide medical care and keep quiet about it. You wanted me to treat criminals. I wanted you to save lives," Alexander corrected. "Sarah, some of these people are good men who work for me because they have families to feed. When they get hurt, they need help. I thought you would understand that." Sarah shook her head. "You thought you could manipulate me into becoming part of your criminal organization." "I thought I could offer you a life better than anything you had ever imagined," Alexander said, his voice growing passionate. "Look around you, Sarah. Look at what I've given you. Your mother's medical bills are paid. You never have to worry about money again. You're loved and protected and cherished. By a criminal. By a man who would do anything for you," Alexander shot back. "Sarah, my methods might be unconventional, but my feelings for you are completely real. I love you more than I have ever loved anyone." The intensity in his voice made Sarah's heart ache, because despite everything, part of her still loved him too. The man who brought her coffee during night shifts, who held her when she cried about losing patience, who made her feel beautiful and precious. That man had been real, even if he was also someone else entirely. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. Alexander's expression became unreadable again. That depends on you. What do you mean? I mean you have a choice to make, Alexander said carefully. You can accept the truth about who I am and stay with me, knowing that our life together will be more complicated than you originally thought. Or, he didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah heard the threat in his silence. Or what? She whispered. Or we'll have to find another solution to this problem. Sarah's blood turned cold. She was trapped in a penthouse with a man who had just revealed himself to be capable of violence, dependent on him for everything with nowhere to run. Alexander, she said carefully, I need time to think about this. Of course, he said, but his tone suggested that her thinking time would be limited. But Sarah, I want you to remember something while you're deciding. What? Alexander leaned forward, and for a moment his expression was the same gentle, loving look she had fallen for. Everything I've done because I love you. Everything I will do will be to protect what we have together. I won't let anyone or anything take you away from me. The words sounded like a promise and a threat at the same time. As Sarah looked into Alexander's eyes, she realized that she wasn't just discovering his secrets. She was discovering that the man she loved was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and that her own life might depend on convincing him that she could accept who he really was. But the terrifying truth was that part of her was actually considering it. Despite everything, despite the lies and manipulation and violence, she still loved Alexander Kane. And that realization scared her more than anything else he had revealed. The next few days passed in a strange, tense normalcy. Alexander continued going to work at the hospital, performing surgeries and saving lives as if nothing had changed. He still brought Sarah coffee, still kissed her goodbye each morning, still told her he loved her. But now Sarah saw the careful way he watched her, analyzing her every expression and reaction. She felt like she was living with two different men. During the day, Alexander was the gentle doctor she had fallen in love with. But at night, when he thought she was asleep, Sarah would hear him making phone calls in his study, his voice taking on that cold, authoritative tone she had overheard before. Sarah knew she was being tested. Every conversation felt like an examination to see if she could accept Alexander's true nature. And the most disturbing part was that she found herself wanting to pass the test. Despite everything she had learned, Sarah couldn't stop loving Alexander. When he held her, she felt safe. When he looked at her with those intense blue eyes, she felt cherished. The connection between them was real, even if it had been built on lies. But loving him didn't mean she could ignore what he was. On Thursday evening, Alexander came home with a different energy about him. He seemed agitated, checking his phone constantly and pacing around the penthouse. Bad day at the hospital? Sarah asked carefully. Work problems, Alexander replied. But Sarah could tell he wasn't talking about medicine. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Sarah's heart started racing. Okay. Have you talked to anyone about what you discovered? Have you told anyone about my other business interests? No, Sarah said truthfully. I haven't spoken to anyone. Alexander studied her face intently. Not your friend Jessica? Not your mother? You haven't made any phone calls or sent any messages? No, Alexander. I told you I haven't said anything to anyone. Something in Alexander's expression relaxed slightly. Good. Because, Sarah, there are people who would use information about me to hurt both of us. I need to know that you understand how dangerous it would be if the wrong people found out what you know. The way he said it made Sarah realize that she wasn't just keeping Alexander's secrets, she was protecting her own life. That night, Alexander received a phone call that changed everything. Sarah was in the bathroom getting ready for bed when she heard him answer his phone with sharp urgency. What do you mean he's talking? Alexander's voice carried through the thin bathroom door. I thought we had an understanding with him. Sarah crept closer to the door, her heart pounding. No, that's not acceptable. Alexander continued, his voice growing dangerous. If he's talking to the police, then he's broken our agreement. You know what needs to happen? There was a long pause. I don't care if he has a family, Alexander said coldly. He should have thought about that before he decided to become a problem. Handle it tonight. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from gasping. Alexander was ordering someone to be killed. Not just hurt or threatened, but actually killed. When she came out of the bathroom, Alexander was sitting on the edge of the bed looking troubled. "Everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice normal. "Just work," he said, but his smile seemed forced. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what we discussed the other night." Sarah sat beside him, her mind still reeling from what she had overheard. "What about it?" "I think it might be time for you to meet some of my business associates. If you're going to be part of my life completely, you should understand all aspects of what I do." The suggestion terrified Sarah, but she forced herself to nod. "If that's what you want." Alexander turned to face her fully. "Tomorrow night I'm having a meeting here. Important clients who need to discuss some financial arrangements. I'd like you to be present, maybe help serve drinks. Get a feel for how these relationships work." Sarah realized that Alexander was testing her again, seeing if she could be trusted around his criminal associates. "Are you sure that's a good idea? Won't they be suspicious of an outsider?" "I've told them about you," Alexander said. "They know you're important to me. They also know that you're smart enough to understand the value of discretion." The implication was clear. Alexander had told his criminal associates that Sarah knew about his activities and could be trusted. There was no going back now. The next evening, Sarah spent hours getting ready, choosing a dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing. She wanted to appear trustworthy and unremarkable to Alexander's dangerous associates. When the men arrived, Sarah was shocked by how normal they seemed. Instead of the thugs she had expected, Alexander's guests were well-dressed businessmen who could have been clients of any legitimate financial firm. They greeted Alexander with respect and treated Sarah with polite courtesy. During the evening, Sarah served drinks and listened to conversations that sounded like ordinary business discussions. Talk of territories and collections was disguised as market share and client services. References to enforcement were phrased as customer relations. It was a sophisticated operation that bore no resemblance to the criminal enterprises she had seen in movies. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to understand the scope of Alexander's organization. He wasn't just a small-time loan shark. He was running a major financial operation that served dozens of clients and employed numerous people. His associates spoke about him with a mixture of respect and fear that made it clear he was a powerful figure in the criminal underworld. Near the end of the meeting, one of the men mentioned the situation Alexander had been discussing on the phone the night before. "The Rodriguez problem has been resolved," he reported quietly. "It won't be an issue anymore." Alexander nodded approvingly. "Good. I want to make sure everyone understands that talking to law enforcement is not in anyone's best interest." Sarah's blood turned cold as she realized she was listening to a discussion about murder as casually as if they were talking about the weather. After the men left, Alexander was in an excellent mood. He praised Sarah for how well she had handled meeting his associates and told her how proud he was of her. "You see," he said, pulling her into his arms, "it's not as scary as you thought. These are just businessmen who operate outside traditional channels. What we do isn't that different from what banks do. We just have more flexible collection methods." Sarah forced herself to smile and nod, but inside she was screaming. Alexander was trying to normalize murder and violence, to make her complicit in his crimes by degrees until she couldn't see a way out. As they got ready for bed, Alexander was more affectionate than he had been since the night she discovered his secrets. He held her close and whispered about their future together, about the life they would build. "I love you, Sarah," he said softly. "More than anything in the world. Promise me you'll never leave me." "I promise," Sarah whispered back, and realized that it might be the most dangerous promise she had ever made. Lying in the dark beside him, Sarah understood that she was trapped in a situation far more complex than she had imagined. Alexander Kane wasn't just a criminal. He was a man who had built an empire on violence and fear. And somehow she had become the most important thing in his world, which made her both protected and imprisoned at the same time. The man she loved was a killer, and he was never going to let her go. 3 months had passed since Sarah discovered the truth about Alexander Kane, and she had fallen into a routine that felt both natural and terrifying. She had learned to live with the knowledge that the man she loved was capable of ordering someone's death as easily as ordering dinner. She had become skilled at pretending that everything was normal while knowing that nothing would ever be normal again. Alexander, for his part, seemed to believe that Sarah had fully accepted his double life. He included her in more business dinners, introduced her to his associates as his partner, and even asked for her medical opinion when treating injured members of his organization. Sarah had saved 3 lives in Alexander's penthouse, treating gunshot wounds and knife injuries while trying not to think about how these people had been hurt. But late at night, when Alexander slept peacefully beside her, Sarah would lie awake planning her escape. She had been carefully saving small amounts of cash, hiding them in places Alexander would never look. She had researched women's shelters and witness protection programs. She had even identified a contact at the FBI who specialized in organized crime. The problem was that Sarah had fallen too deep into Alexander's world. She had treated criminals, attended their meetings, and kept their secrets. In the eyes of the law, she might be considered an accomplice rather than a victim. Worse, Alexander's surveillance of her had become more sophisticated. She suspected he was tracking her phone, monitoring her emails, and possibly even having her followed when she went to work. But the most difficult obstacle to leaving was that Sarah still loved him. Despite everything, the lies, the manipulation, the violence, Alexander had never been anything but gentle and loving toward her. He remembered her favorite flowers, surprised her with thoughtful gifts, and held her when she had bad days at the hospital. The connection between them was real, even if it was also dangerous. Sarah's internal conflict came to a head on a Tuesday evening when Alexander came home visibly upset. He poured himself a large glass of whiskey and sat in his chair, staring out at the city lights. "Bad day?" Sarah asked gently. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to share what was troubling him. "One of my oldest associates was arrested today. Marcus Rodriguez." Sarah's heart skipped. She remembered hearing that name. Rodriguez was the man whose problem had been resolved months ago. "I thought Rodriguez was dead?" Alexander finished. "No, that was his brother. Marcus was the one who had been talking to the police, but he went underground before we could reach him. Apparently, he's been cooperating with the FBI for months." Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. If the FBI had an informant inside Alexander's organization, they might be building a case against him. This could be her chance to escape if she could find a way to contact them safely. "What does this mean for you?" she asked. Alexander's expression hardened. "It means I need to be very careful about who I trust. Marcus knew details about my operations that could be very damaging if they fall into the wrong hands." The way he looked at Sarah when he said trust sent a chill down her spine. After months of seeming acceptance, was Alexander beginning to suspect her again? "Alexander," she said carefully, "you know you can trust me, right?" He studied her face intently. "Can I, Sarah? Because if Marcus has been talking to the FBI, they're going to be looking for ways to get closer to me. They might try to use people close to me as leverage." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that anyone in my life could potentially be compromised, including you." The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah realized that Alexander's paranoia was making him dangerous to everyone around him, including her. "Alexander, I love you," she said, moving closer to him. "I would never do anything to hurt you." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, the same gentle gesture that had made her fall for him in the beginning. "I know you love me, Sarah, but love doesn't always protect us from making mistakes." That night, Sarah waited until Alexander was deeply asleep before slipping out of bed. She couldn't wait any longer. Marcus Rodriguez's arrest meant the FBI was closing in, and Sarah needed to get out before she became collateral damage in Alexander's paranoid efforts to protect himself. She gathered the cash she had hidden throughout the penthouse, along with copies of documents she had secretly photographed from Alexander's study. Evidence of his criminal activities that might help the FBI and might protect her from being prosecuted as an accomplice. As Sarah prepared to leave, she took one last look at Alexander sleeping peacefully in their bed. Even knowing what he was capable of, even knowing that he had manipulated her from the beginning, leaving him felt like tearing her heart out. She loved him. That was the truth she couldn't escape. She loved a man who was dangerous, violent, and possibly beyond redemption. But she also loved herself enough to know that staying would eventually destroy her. Sarah slipped out of the penthouse and took the emergency stairs to avoid the elevator cameras. She had memorized the building's security patterns and knew she had a small window to escape undetected. But as she reached the lobby, her heart sank. Marcus Rodriguez was standing by the main entrance, very much alive and clearly waiting for her. "Going somewhere, Sarah?" he asked with a knowing smile. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus wasn't cooperating with the FBI. He was still working for Alexander. The story about his arrest had been a test and she had failed it completely. "I was just going for a walk," she said weakly. Marcus laughed. "With a bag full of cash and stolen documents? Sarah, Alexander suspected you might try something like this. He's been watching you for weeks." "Where is he?" Sarah asked, knowing her escape attempt was over. "Upstairs, waiting for you to come back so you can all have a conversation about trust and loyalty." Sarah realized that Alexander had never believed she had accepted his criminal life. He had been testing her, watching for signs that she would try to betray him, and she had just given him all the evidence he needed. As Marcus escorted her back to the elevator, Sarah understood that she was no longer Alexander's girlfriend or his partner. She was his prisoner, and possibly his next victim. When the elevator doors opened on the penthouse floor, Alexander was standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour. His expression was calm, but Sarah could see the cold anger in his eyes. "Hello, Sarah," he said quietly. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about our relationship." As Sarah walked toward the man she loved and feared in equal measure, she realized that the fairy tale was finally over. Alexander Kane had been pretending to trust her just as much as she had been pretending to accept him. Now they were both done pretending, and Sarah had no idea if she would survive the truth. "I was hoping you wouldn't disappoint me," Alexander said as he closed the penthouse door behind them. "But I suppose I should have known better. After all, you're not the first woman I've had to deal with who couldn't appreciate what I was offering her." The casual way he mentioned other women made Sarah's blood run cold. How many others had there been? And what had happened to them when they tried to leave? As Alexander led her into the living room where they had shared so many tender moments, Sarah realized that she was about to find out exactly how far Dr. Alexander Kane was willing to go to protect his secrets, and whether the love he claimed to feel for her was stronger than his need to eliminate threats to his criminal empire.